Chapter 1. I rolled in on the old Santa Fe. I rolled in on the old Santa Fe in 1920, cross-country from Chicago. Landed in Los Angeles with my mother and no job. $300 between the two of us in a land we knew nothing about. First thing, we had to find a place to live. We started hunting and found a small apartment on Lake Street, opposite Westlake Park. It was $37.50 a month, furnished. The next thing was where to get a job. I didn't know where to go or what to do, but I stopped to talk with a milkman, and he told me about a Vandecamp's bakery for sale opposite Westlake Park on 7th Street. There were a couple of bids for it, but I offered $100 more than they did, our whole savings, and I got it. Vandecamp's would do the baking and bring the baked goods into the store at 6 in the morning. Mother and I worked on consignment. The more we sold, the more money we made. The bakery happened to be in a lucky spot, right next to the bus stop, where people could run in, get some pies, cakes, cookies, and what have you, and run out to catch the next bus. Well, my mother was in seventh heaven because making a buck was all she cared about. And talk about selling bread! All the big mucky-mucks who came from the East sat in Westlake Park to pass the time away and fed the pigeons and ducks, and that took a lot of bread. In those days, there was no smog in Los Angeles, and the stars in the sky were as big as your fist. It seemed like you could reach up and pick one out of the sky. The air was perfumed with orange trees and lemons and every kind of fruit you could think of, even bean fields which were close by. I remember the time I drove up Wilshire Boulevard and dug up a couple of wild rose bushes and took them home to my own backyard. Nobody would say anything. I found myself getting up at 5:30 in the morning to hit the bakery by 6. It was wonderful walking through the park at that time of day. Everything was great, as long as we could make $1. One morning at about 7:30, I noticed that a bunch of trucks loaded with movie equipment were parked outside our little shop. Some of the men came in for donuts, and one of them noticed me standing behind the counter. We started talking, and he asked me if I wanted to make $5 as an extra. All I had to do was walk back and forth in front of the camera. I agreed right away, asked my mother to mind the shop, and spent the rest of the day on a movie set, walking back and forth, just as the guy had said. From there, I went to an old tumble-down shack in Hollywood, which was the casting office. This shack supplied all the studios with extras. I started going there whenever I could, and got a lot of work. We earned from $5 to $7.50 a day. One day, when I was in the shack collecting my pay for a day's work, I noticed a native girl from the islands. I started talking to her, and she told me she was an expert at the hula. She said she could teach me if I had any rhythm. I turned out to be the best dancer on the West Coast. Director Todd Browning was making a picture called Under Two Flags, 1922, with Priscilla Dean. Well, I was hired as the knife dancer in the desert in that film. After that, everybody wanted me. Mabel Normand was a top star on the Mack Sennett lot, and she was also his sweetheart. One night, we were all working on a Mabel Normand picture, and she was supposed to do a Mexican hat dance. I ended up doubling for her dancing, jumping in and out of this big Mexican hat. Of course, Mabel got the close-ups, but my feet got a couple of close-ups too. Everybody had such a wonderful time that day. We had so much to eat and drink, it was like a big fiesta. Later that night, Mabel and Mac had a huge fight in her dressing room. I really thought they were going to come to blows. Everybody pretended they didn't hear anything, but it was plenty loud. The next day, there was a big commotion on the lot. Nobody could find the film that was shot the night before. Mabel, to get even with Mac, broke into the cutting room and stole the film and stashed it in milk bottles. She put the bottles in a box on her windowsill, so you could only see the tops of the bottles. Nobody would ever dream of looking for the missing film there. They searched that studio from top to bottom. Finally, Mac said they'd have to shoot the scenes all over again. By that time, Mabel had quieted down and was pretty calm and realized what she had done. She called the prop man and confessed. She had just wanted to get even with Mac. Mac's Senate studio was over in Edendale, right across the street from Clara Kimball Young's studio, which we would often visit. We had so much fun on the Senate lot with the Mac Senate bathing beauties and the Keystone Cops, Charlie Chaplin, Harry Langdon, Wally Beery, and many more I could name. I remember the time I was tied to a railroad track and the train was supposed to go over me, but never touched me. I used to jump off barns into haystacks, and they would run the handcars all over the lot with the Keystone Cops after us. At that time, Carole Lombard was one of the Mac Senate bathing beauties. Gloria Swanson was there, and Bed Turpin, who could cross his eyes any time, and Snuff Pollard, who was one of the Keystone Cops who would run around with his pants hanging down. This was about the time that Carole Lombard had a bad automobile accident. Years later, I made her face up for the camera at Paramount Studios. Carole was noted for that high forehead of hers, and I never tried to change it like I did for other stars that needed it. The scar that went from her left nostril into her cheek was never noticed because I would fill it before I made her up. Soon there wasn't a star in Hollywood that I didn't double for in dancing. I did every country, folk dance, Egyptian dance, any dance you could think of, I did. And the funny part of it was, except for my brief hula training, I never had a lesson in my life. And I always got an extra check from the director and the casting office for having the fire that it took to please the camera. I remember doing a Spanish dance for the Greta Garbo movie Torrent, 1926, and every colored flower that was in the Spanish shawl I was wearing was printed on my skin from the sweat. They had me dancing all day until Lou Cody, if you remember him, said, "Give that girl a rest before she falls on her face." That didn't mean a thing to me, because I knew I was going to get an extra check for being such a good fake. With most of the dances I did, I never knew what my feet were going to do exactly, but it always came out great. And if they ever asked me to do it again, I could never do the same thing, since I really didn't know what I was doing. I remember back then I had a big Rio car, and I used to pick up 5 or 6 of us and go from studio to studio. Gilbert Rowland was one of the gang. When we would hit the old Lasky Studios on Vine Street, I would see Mervyn LeRoy looking for extra work there, too. And of course, he later became one of the giants of our industry. Gilbert Rowland sure made it, too, because the women stars were crazy about him. I remember once at the old Thomas Ince studio, they had a black band and a white one. They had been rehearsing with a dance for several days with those 2 bands, but the director wasn't satisfied with the dancer, so he told his assistant, "Get me Dottie Ponedel." When I heard this, I was worried that I wouldn't measure up. But Danny, the assistant, assured me of getting a nice bit of money if I did. When I got there and into the costume and out on the set, I was scared out of my wits. And when they asked me which band I wanted, I said, "Let both bands double their time and play as loud as they can go, 'cause I don't know where I'm going to land." As soon as the take was done, the director yelled to Danny, "Why didn't you get me this ball of fire in the first place?" He came down and thanked me and asked me if I would like to have dinner with him. I knew what that meant, and my knees started to hit each other. I felt something warm trickle down my leg. I looked down at the floor, and behold, I had done it. I rushed to take the costume off, and Danny put me in a limousine and sent me home, because the assistant directors who knew me knew I was a good girl, but the directors didn't. After doing those dances, they thought I was a sure pushover, but I wasn't. I remember working with Rudolph Valentino on The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, 1921. At that time, he was married to a little girl who played extra with us. Her name was Jean Acker. That was his first wife, and she was just full of fun. When they got a divorce, Jean would always say, "I was his first wife, he was my first husband, and nobody can take that away from me." I also worked with Valentino on The Chic, 1921. Vilma Banky was his leading lady then. She was a very beautiful girl. That picture was done on the old Lasky lot, which was later Paramount Studios. We had about 2 weeks' work on that picture, as they used a lot of extras. That was about the time that Jesse Lasky imported Pola Nigri from Europe. He ordered a big shindig in her honor and told everybody they had to be there in full dress. He had 2 bands playing. It was the biggest party Hollywood had ever seen, and at that time, Gloria Swanson was the pet of the lot. Everybody catered to her, and when she was told to appear at this dinner for this big foreign star, it didn't go so good with her, and she never appeared. But with the entertainment and the good food, I don't think anybody missed her. I could see those love glances between Valentino and Negri. I knew something was going to happen there. They became buddy-buddy because they were always seen together. In The Four Horsemen, his leading lady was Alice Terry. Now, Alice Terry and Rex Ingram, the director of the picture, were married. Rex Ingram was tall, handsome, and he should have been a star in his own right. I even did a dance on a table once for D.W. Griffith, doubling for Lupe Velez, who later committed suicide. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. What am I, 101 years old? I'm going to say what all the other stars say. I started at the age of 2. Lou Telligin was a European actor they brought to the old Vitagraph studio from Paris. He was Sarah Bernhardt's leading man. I was doing an Egyptian dance in that picture, and after the picture, he gave a big party in his Beverly Hills home. He asked Paul, a mutual friend of ours who was a Frenchman, to bring me up to this party. When we got there, everybody was loaded, and when Lou saw me, he saw the Egyptian dancer instead of the human being. I never ran up and down so many stairs in my life. I finally got outside and into Paul's car and laid down on the floor so I wouldn't be noticed when he came running outside. When Paul came outside, I went, "Psst," and Paul came to the car and drove me home. He knew what was on Lou's mind. It seems every time I did a dance, I got into trouble with the male sex. I remember I got a call to go up to the office of some honcho whose name I forget. I think his name was Abe. I thought I was going to get a contract, and I never moved so fast in my life. When I got up there, he asked me so many questions about my life. I said, "What has this got to do with what you want me for?" He said, "How would you like to have a pretty house in Beverly Hills, pretty clothes, and anything you want?" Well, I said to myself, here we go again. These big guys had offices that looked like Grand Central Station. I did a hop, skip, and jump around the oval table, and he after me. Well, it got so funny to me, I sat down and laughed out loud, even though I knew it was becoming serious, because I could see that wild look in his eye. I told him everything he wanted to hear until I got out of that door. My friend, the native girl, was called in for an interview at MGM, and she asked me to come along. Lo and behold, I was picked for the part that she was hoping to do. They liked what I did so much that the next day, a director by the name of Hopper called me up and asked me to come down to the still department to pose for some pictures. Clarence Bull, the head of the still department, had a corner all fixed up with a couch, pillows, and drapes. Everything was ready. Hopper came in and said, "Now, Dottie, I want you to go in the dressing room and undress. We're going to take some nude pictures." I turned around, gave him one look, and said, "You must be kidding." I told him I want all my interesting points draped or no go. I talked high, wide, and handsome, and wound up posing for fancy bathing suits and knit suits published in the magazine under the MGM banner. The articles said that I had deserted the musical comedy stage to appear in their pictures, which was the laugh of the century, since my only previous job was working in the Boston store in Chicago. I played an Indian character called Little Wolf in a film called Galloping Vengeance, 1925, with cowboy star Bob Custer. Although I had a pear-shaped bust that pointed up to your nose, they tied those things down, put a dirty shirt on me, a dirty half-cut wig, a pair of lousy pants, and I was Little Wolf. We did our work in an old barn on Sunset Boulevard. Growing up where I did in Chicago, I don't think I ever even saw a horse, but they plopped me on a horse that I thought was as big as a mountain. They asked me if I could ride, and I said, "Oh, sure," even though I was turning into stone from fright. I held onto the reins as the horse went up a steep hill. Bob Custer was right behind me on his own horse. As we looked down, we looked into kind of a small lake. After the shot was completed, I was so relieved as we were riding down the hill that I lost my balance and fell into the water. Believe it or not, whatever this water had in it, my hair was curly from then on. I told that story to Joan Blondell years later, and she said, "Well, for God's sake, find out where the hell it is and let's go there." I couldn't tell her where it was or where the location was, 'cause I didn't know. Wished I did. I'd make myself a nice mint of money. And believe it or not, my hair is still curly. For several years, I went on working as a double for the stars, an Italian dancer at Universal, a French dancer at Warner Brothers, you name it, I did it. I remember when Carole Lombard had Billy Wilder and Irving Thalberg at Universal. I believe that Billy was just a messenger boy then, while Thalberg was known as the genius, even though he was very young. Later on, Billy would direct these short westerns with Hoot Gibson and Art Accord. And if a company ever needed to go on location, the boss, Carole Lombard, would say, "A tree is a tree and a stone is a stone. Do it on the back lot." There were no runaway pictures then, for we all worked as a big family. Not only Universal, but every studio in town. Los Angeles was a very different town back then. I remember the night in the early 1920s when all of Los Angeles went downtown to Broadway to see the first streetlights lit up. The street dance that followed was a thing you would never forget because everybody you looked at seemed to be loaded, and everybody was making love to somebody. Too bad it couldn't go on forever. After the streetlight dance, I got myself home, as I had an early call the next morning at Universal. I was playing a gypsy girl, dancing on the streets of New York, and banging on a tambourine, wearing some old dirty clothes that stunk to high heaven. In order to get to Universal City back then, you had to drive over the Cahuenga Pass. It was so high and narrow that 2 cars couldn't pass safely at one time. One car had to hug the mountainside, while the other got around it to come down or go up. The whole pass was lined with tall eucalyptus trees, which filled the air with an aroma that was worth the trouble of getting up there. Universal often kept a bus waiting at the bottom of the hill to pick up the extras that couldn't make it up on their own. Today, you can drive over the Cahuenga Pass like any other street, because the beautiful hill has been blasted away. Not only was the Cahuenga Pass blasted away, But Angel's Flight, which was my favorite ride, has been disassembled. Angel's Flight consisted of a small cable car, about half the size of the cable cars in San Francisco, and about 1/3 the size of the elevator that goes up and down the Eiffel Tower. The car started from Temple Street, went straight up a hill to a plateau which was called Bunker Hill. Sometimes as I rode up and down, I would bring along a brown paper sack full of sandwiches and cookies. I would give the attendant some of these, hoping for a free ride. I usually got it. I don't think there is anyone who loves Los Angeles more than I do, and to see it cut up into a puzzle of freeways and our mountains blasted away and our beaches being polluted makes me really sad. What's happening to L.A.? They come and take your home away, saying it's in the name of progress, and they never even use the land they took from you, and you're left without a home. I remember looking up at the mountains, and the lights in the windows looked like glowworms flittering all over the hill. What a beautiful sight! Now it's blanketed with a sheet of gray smog, which damn near chokes you to death. Where is my beautiful L.A.? Her face may be marred, but she's still called the City of the Angels. One day, I was working on the Paramount lot, doing a hula dance, and I overheard Charlie Boyle, the cameraman, discussing Nancy Carroll's makeup. He didn't like the spit curls on her high cheekbones. Since she had a heart-shaped face, this made her cheekbones too prominent. Charlie was trying to make them less so. And me, with my big mouth, said, "Why don't you shade her face with a darker grease paint?" Nancy, who overheard me, asked me if I would try it out on her. I went to her dressing room and made her up in the way I thought she should be made up. Well, the test came out fine, and Nancy went to the production office and asked if I could be put on the picture as her makeup artist. The production office said no, she couldn't have me. Nancy, with that Irish temper, said she'd do it herself. But she did such a lousy job on purpose that the cameraman couldn't shoot it. They wasted a whole morning, which would have paid my salary for a year. Well, Nancy won a point because the production office called me the next day and asked me to come and make her up for the picture. The name of the picture was Follow Through, 1930, co-starring Buddy Rogers and Jack Haley. It seems I had a natural talent for makeup and seeing how actresses or actors should look in front of a camera. From that time on, I did makeup only and was one of the first makeup artists under contract to Paramount. As the years went by, I stole whatever methods I could find, learned as much as I could from wherever I could, and perfected my makeup ideas and techniques. I remember one time when I was working with Nancy Carroll, it was around Easter, and she asked me over for dinner. On the way to her house, I stopped and bought a live Easter bunny for her little girl, who was around 5 years old. After dinner, she came to us and said she couldn't find her bunny. Nancy and I started to search the house. And guess where I found it? In the toilet, drowned. We all pretended to be searching for the rabbit while Nancy ran up to the pet shop and got another one. The little girl never knew anything about it. If she is reading this, it is the first time she will find out that she had a stand-in bunny. At the studios, the makeup men hated my guts. They called me everything under the sun because I wouldn't make charts to show them what I was doing. Why should I, the way they were treating me? If they were smart, they would have done the same as I. Take a little from this painting and that painting and use a little imagination, and they would have the Ponedel makeup style. That's how I became so well known. A top dancer on the West Coast, tops in my profession of makeup, with a lot of imagination, guts, and bluff. I became something the stars would yell for, and I must say that the man upstairs had his arms around me. I think he must like me a little bit, as whatever I undertook to do, I always came out on top. Thank you, God.